This is Charter Local Edition. My name is Brad Pomerance. We are in Washington, D.C., and we are joined by a member of Congress representing the state of California. His name is Adam Schiff. He is the ranking member on the House Intelligence Committee and, as a result, intricately involved in the reform of the Patriot Act. What can you tell us about it as it relates to the collection of telephone records?
One of the provisions of the Patriot Act that was expiring is one that authorized the collection of bulk metadata. And what that is information that the phone companies hold, which is numbers connected to other numbers, the time of phone calls, the date of phone calls. It doesn't contain the content, so there are no recordings, but nonetheless it was data the government was acquiring in bulk. Many people were concerned by the privacy implications of that, and this bill did an end to bulk collection and rather move to a model where the telephone companies hold on to their own records. And when there's a need to get information, for example, we get a cell phone from a terrorist, we want to know who have they been in contact with in the United States. We can then, with lawful process, go to the phone companies. They can then test their bulk metadata. And that way we get out of the business of gathering that data ourselves.
What I'm wondering, though, is if the government is in possession of the data without having to go to the telephone companies, could they not run algorithms to look for patterns to the benefit of our national security?
Well, in theory, the answer is yes, although we have to remember that this data involves millions of Americans who have no connection with crime and for which there's no probable cause to believe that any of them are connected with crime. And generally, that's not something that we want to see happen in terms of our privacy, and that is have the government essentially go on a fishing expedition looking for evidence of criminality.
But if there's no recording of conversations, is privacy implicated? It's just telephone numbers.
You know, it's still implicated because I think people have an expectation that if their phone calls, even though the contents, what they actually say on the phone is not recorded, but the fact that they're calling someone else, that their number is reaching out to other numbers, I think people still have an expectation that that will be private unless the government has reason to believe that they're involved in some kind of criminal activity.
So the government will have to go to a court and show probable cause if they want to access telephone records. Which court?
Well, it'll go to the FISA Court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, so it's not a regular criminal court. And actually the showing is less than probable cause. They only have to show a reasonable, articulable suspicion, called the RAS standard, that a number is connected with a plot.
So it begs the question then, because there had been tremendous criticism about that process when the government was going to the FISA Court, because there was no one on the other side to argue against the government's position. Has that changed?
Exactly, that's a very good point. That was another component of the USA Freedom Act that has now been signed by the President. We not only did away with the bulk metadata collection, but we also established an office of a special advocate within the FISA Court so that the FISA Court judges will hear a contrary view in very significant cases, cases of constitutional dimension. We do want someone there to represent the privacy interests of the public, and this bill establishes that.
Who will decide when that special advocate should be brought into the process?
Well, that's a great question, too. Ultimately, the judges will decide.
I see.
Now, they are supposed to call for that attorney in these cases of significant constitutional dimension, but there is some discretion with the court about when they think that would be necessary, appropriate. We pushed for as strong a language as we could, that they shall appoint. Others wanted it to be much more open-ended, that they have the option, and we found, I think, some middle ground. But the expectation is that in significant cases that this will be employed.
So in the final analysis, as someone who has really been in the trenches on this issue for years, do you feel as if the new Freedom Act, we'll call it, is an appropriate compromise that balances the interests of privacy and national security appropriately?
It really is, and quite amazing for a Congress that is so dysfunctional. But this very difficult issue, the intersection between privacy and security, that aroused very strong passions on both sides, Congress somehow managed to legislate on. We passed this bill in the House with overwhelming support, more than 330 votes for it, majority of Democrats and Republicans, and ditto in the Senate. So it was quite a remarkable and rare achievement for Congress.
And I want to ask about that coalition because it was an odd one. This was not an issue that broke with party lines. You had some Republicans that were in support and some Democrats opposed, and the reverse. How did you build a coalition? Because it was an issue that really cut across party lines.
You know, I think a number of things came together. In part, it was you had civil liberties advocates who really wanted these reforms. In part, it was people who wanted to maintain the capabilities and were concerned that without reform they would lose them altogether. So you had that motivation. And then I think you also had the companies themselves weigh in, the tech companies saying, we have to compete overseas. And it really hurts us if we're viewed as basically an instrument of the intelligence community. And so this helps us economically with our overseas customers that we can maintain some distance from the intelligence community.
I want to ask you about what you describe as the dysfunction of Congress, because when I've spoken with members of Congress who are in certain committees, they insist that X committee is not dysfunctional. For example, Veterans Affairs. I've heard from Democrats and Republicans, we are incredibly bipartisan, and I believe them. Is it the same on intelligence?
It is the same.
I would presume.
Yeah.
Explain why and how.
And actually, it hasn't always been that way. But
really?
I have a very good relationship with the chair.
Who's the chair now?
Devin Nunes.
And,
so
from California.
Two Californians.
Right. And he's a new chair. I believe the predecessor, was he from Michigan?
Yes.
Who stepped down?
Exactly.
Right.
And the prior chair and prior ranking member had a good relationship too.
Okay.
But in the past, it has been a contentious committee as well. But happily, now we have a very good working relationship. We, certainly have areas of disagreement. We agree to disagree, but we try not to let those disagreements prevent us from doing the work where we can find common ground.
But why is it that in this moment in time we are seeing that air of bipartisanship? What's working? Because look, I could see a scenario with what's going on in the Middle East, what's going on in the Crimea, that there could be a lot of rancor. Why is it working right now?
Well, it's not working everywhere. It is working within our committee. And
that's what I mean.
I have a theory about it, which is frankly not a very uplifting theory, but I think part of it is, frankly, the Intelligence Committee has most of its hearings in closed classified session because we're dealing with classified information. And as a result, there's no grandstanding. There's no one to grandstand to. And so the members kind of roll up their sleeves. Nobody puts on airs. No one is basically acting for the benefit of an audience somewhere. And I think that changes the nature of the meeting. Now, that's not a justification to go to closed session with other committees.
I understand.
But nonetheless, I do think it has a salutary impact. The other thing I would say, Brad, is that the subject matter is inherently less partisan, or at least it should be. It deals with our national security and national defense, and it's not the usual kind of hot button red meat that the parties fight over.
But right now we're in a precarious position nationally. What's happening in the Middle East is daunting and confusing. And so without revealing classified information, obviously, what can you tell us about where we are today as it relates to the crises in the Middle East?
Well, you're right. It's extremely challenging, and just knowing who the players are and who's aligned with whom varies from country to country, space to space.
Of course.
We are dealing with the incredible dislocation that was brought about by the Arab Spring.
Right.
When you have governments toppling, you have large stateless expanses.
So much hope then. What happened?
It is horribly tragic. The only country that has really gotten it right is tiny Tunisia.
Right.
The place where it all started, where that fruit vendor set himself ablaze.
Right.
They have gotten the governance right. But interestingly and ironically, part of the reason why Tunisia got it right is that Egypt got it wrong. Tunisia watched what happened in Egypt, and of course Tunisia's watched what's happened in Syria and elsewhere, and they decided, okay, that's not where we want to go. And so even though the Islamist Party won in the first election, as they did in many of these post-Arab Spring governments, it nonetheless stepped aside when it proved incapable of governing well, something that these other Islamist governments have not been willing to do.
His name is Adam Schiff, member of the U.S. Congress. My name is Brad Pomerance. It's Charlotte Local Edition.